Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll let folks get in and we will start momentarily. All right, thank you so much for joining us today with our presenter, Kris Kelly on Recovery Capital. This webinar is brought to you by the Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC, as well as SAMHSA. Just a reminder that the views expressed in this webinar are the views of the trainer and do not officially reflect the position of SAMHSA and DHHS. The Great Lakes ATTC, PTTC, and MHTTC believe that language matters and words have power. The TTC networks use affirming language to promote the promises of recovery by advancing evidence-based and culturally informed practices. Just a few housekeeping items for you. If you have any technical issues, please individually message Rebecca Bullard or Alyssa Kuala in the chat section of your at the bottom of your screen, and we would be happy to assist you. Questions for the speaker: we will be asking the speaker any questions that you may have, as long as you put them in the Q&A section. So please put any questions that you have in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all those who attend the full session. The recording and PowerPoint will be on our Great Lakes ATTC webpage as well following the training. If you would like to stay up to date on any upcoming trainings, please visit our websites and follow us on social media. And I'm super excited to pass this over to Kris Kelly. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alyssa. Welcome to everyone. I had a little preview of the chat, and it looks like we have a good group representative of different areas all across the US. I'm going to go ahead and pop up my slides here, and we can jump in. Feel free to, like Alyssa said, type your questions into the Q&A section. I have that window closed right now, but I'll let Rebecca, I'll pause and answer questions in real time. So feel free to ask anything if I'm not being clear, or if you want me to go a little deeper on a topic. But I'm super excited to, first I'll introduce myself. So I'm Kris Kelly, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery. And I work on a couple different projects, a couple different grants. So I am with the Great Lakes Addiction Technology, I don't know why that name, ATTC, just slipped my mind. And also with the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence. Like I said, super excited to be here and dive into the topic of recovery capital. And we'll go deeper into what recovery capital means, its definition, where it came from, but also just a preview. It's really all the building materials somebody needs to sustain a life in long-term recovery. Sorry, I just got to figure out how to get to the next slide. So this is just a reminder that abstinence may or may not be a part of somebody's recovery process. So when we think about recovery, oftentimes we relate it to someone being abstinent or not using any substances. But as we've explored and the research can tell, abstinence may or may not be a part of somebody's recovery process. And really, it's about this improved quality of life, improved functioning, improved well-being, regaining our relationships, finding employment where we feel valued, growing our knowledge base, connection to a community. I often in my recovery messaging remind people things like, in my recovery, I was able to buy a home and I pay taxes, property taxes on that home, and I own a car and I vote. And to me, those are all things that are a part of a recovery process. So if we dive in and really look at this analogy. And this analogy comes from Dr. John Kelly, who's a professor of addiction medicine at Harvard Medical School. And he also runs the Recovery Research Institute. And those are two great resources, especially the Recovery Research Institute. If you can just Google that name, and he provides really up-to-date resources, research, tools, and different things all about the field of recovery. So he presented recovery capital in this framework of imagining substance use like a burning building. And most of what we do in our field currently is we've gotten really good at identifying that burning building and then working to put that fire out. And those are all things to be applauded. So meaning, 50 years ago, we didn't utilize Narcan. We didn't really have ways to reverse an overdose in the community. We didn't even really have ways to, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. We could identify someone was misusing substances, but we didn't even call it that 50 years ago. And so we know now how to get to medically stabilize someone and how to help them through that process of, like I said, putting that fire out. But when we look at it, we've been, some things we've been less successful at in our field is preventing that fire from restarting. So again, we might call it preventing relapse or a reoccurrence or a return to use. We haven't really found a way to seamlessly look at rebuilding. What are the materials someone might need in order to rebuild their life? And then, of course, providing those materials and access to those materials. And that's where recovery capital comes in. And then those rebuilding permits. And that's an important part of it, because we know a lot of folks who experience substance use challenges oftentimes might experience interactions with the legal system. And those things become barriers to, getting funding to go back to school, to finding employment, to getting safe housing. All those things become barrier, or sometimes our history becomes a barrier to moving forward. And so our system of kind of treatment as it currently is doesn't always help people navigate those barriers. So what are some of the things we can do when we're thinking about helping people access recovery capital, build on their recovery capital? And really what research and studies are telling us currently is building these recovery-oriented systems of care, and really putting that individual at the center of all the support, and ensuring that the support continues in their natural environment. So where they live, work, and play. It can be really difficult to be plucked up out of an environment, go somewhere else and have all the support and the structure to get well, and then be replanted back into that environment where you were sick. If nothing's done to change that environment, if we don't have supports when we return to that environment, and if the people around us really don't know what happened to us while we were over there getting well, it's really hard to maintain that growth and those accomplishments that we had. It's really hard to keep that fire from restarting when we return home, because everything else has remained the same. And then we often don't have really intensive supports when we return home to that natural environment. And so part of building recovery capital is building those connections and ensuring that people have the tools and the resources to reconstruct their lives. And that involves many, many different components of community recovery capital. So when we talk about it, recovery capital is really the sum of resources necessary to initiate and sustain recovery from substance misuse. So when we oftentimes I think about, or when I've trained recovery coaches, I refer to thinking of recovery capital almost like a bank account. And so we make withdrawals and deposits from this bank account. And we need to think about things like our spiritual capital, our emotional capital, our social capital, our cultural capital. There's all these different areas where we can think about capital, and we want to think about making deposits to grow that capital so that we can be prepared when we need to make a withdrawal from that capital. It means showing up and being a good employee at work. It means, if we want, we can enroll and go to school and kind of grow our knowledge capital. It means contributing to our community or our family, becoming a support system. And again, we have to make deposits in order to make withdrawals in those areas. So there's some key components of recovery capital. So if we look at social capital, that's talking about our relationships, our support, and our obligations. And so that kind of goes back to that, the bank account analogy I used. And then we can think about physical recovery capital. That might be our property, our money, again, our car. Do we have a home? Do we feel safe in these spaces? Are these spaces supportive of our recovery capital or our recovery? When we think about human capital, those are things like our hopes and our dreams. When I came into recovery, it took a while before I felt really safe to have hopes and dreams, because I had experienced a life where those things weren't, it was bleak, it was a kind of a dark cloud. And so I needed to build a life where I felt like I had the permission to hope and dream again. And when we think about people coming into recovery, one of the biggest indicators of success in recovery is hope. When we think about that, that's pretty amazing. And so as professionals, we want to ensure that the people that we're working with feel hopeful. And one of the ways we can do that is by surrounding them with individuals and communities that support their recovery. And then when we think about cultural capital, the values, belief, and attitudes that link to social, well, it says social conformity, but it's really, again, the values, beliefs, and norms of the communities where we live, work, and play. Specific to this webinar about alcohol is still a drug, I think that's really important to consider because drinking and using alcohol is often really normalized in our society. And being in recovery from an alcohol use disorder might make you feel really othered from that community. And so we need to work to normalize recovery. We need to work to normalize not using alcohol so that you don't feel so othered when you return to your community or that culture. I was just talking to a friend about this when we were watching a film, and a disclaimer came up about, warning, this film contains smoking, violence, language. And in the film, someone had a return to use, and it was made to be kind of funny. And I was thinking when I was out walking and thinking about, well, why don't we have a warning that that indicates somebody had a return to use in this film? Because that again is kind of normalized in our current world, in our culture. And so these are things to just kind of think about. So when we talk about recovery capital, there's a long history to it, and there's a framework that we can think about when we're talking about recovery capital. And so again, if we look at this grid, we have high recovery capital, low recovery capital, high problem severity, and then low recovery capital. And so I can use myself as an example. Is I was in a high problem severity, but I also had high recovery capital. And to me, looking at my history, it indicates the type of support and the interventions that were really useful for me, because I had a ton of support from my family, my friends, a workplace. I had an environment that was really open to me being in recovery, although I had high problem severity. We might have people in our services who have high problem severity and low recovery capital. And typically that means that those individuals might need more intensive clinical support, but they're also going to need more intensive community support because they don't have that recovery capital when they return home to reinforce the things that they learned through their treatment or their therapy or whatever experience they had. And that's just completely vital so that that person, if they have a return to use or if they're struggling, that there's these natural supports that raise up and wrap around them.
Kris,
Yeah, I just saw you unmute, so I'll pause.
we've got a question. Could you give a few examples of high severity complexity?
Yeah, I mean, that's where we get into like DSM-5 and how somebody scores when they go in for a comprehensive assessment. But I would say somebody who's experiencing maybe extreme negative consequences because of their use. And then, of course, there's the physical addiction that people often experience as well. Does that? And in the lens of recovery capital, I don't think it always has to be a clinical assessment. I think an individual can determine if they have high problem severity or complexity. And then, of course, if we add on, if there's a mental illness, we can add on any physical disability somebody might be having. So I think there's many indicators that would put somebody in the high problem severity or complexity area.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, again, in the recovery field, and I come from recovery community organizations, training recovery coaches. This is a framework that will introduce in trainings so that recovery coaches, even though we're not working on the clinical side, we have a framework to help identify kind of where somebody lands that helps us when we jump into recovery management planning. And so I'll go to the next slide because there's some cool things that have been developed over the years, and it's recovery capital scales. And so they're validated evidence-based tools that recovery coaches can use to assess somebody's recovery capital. And this might indicate a need for more treatment, a need for therapy, a need for additional recovery supports, what types of supports, and then additional services like housing, transportation, or if their family requires some support. The original scale was had 35 items or indicators that the participant would respond to, all different areas of life that relate back to their recovery capital. And then on the left side of the screen there, you see some examples of questions. And then 2 newer assessments have been developed. The assessment of recovery capital, which is a 50-item scale. And then I think a really useful one and a good one for a lot of recovery communities is we call it the BARC 10, or the brief assessment of recovery capital. And so that was really taking those 35 items and condensing them down to 10 items. My thinking was it was reduced to 10 because, again, we don't want the recovery community to slip into clinical zones where we're overly reliant on or become overly reliant on assessments as part of our process, because we really want to hear from the individual about the type of support they believe they need, and then help take down the barriers and increase access to those supports. And we know increases in recovery capital can spark turning points that end addiction careers, trigger a recovery initiation, elevate coping abilities, and enhance quality of life and long-term recovery. And so this was a quote by William White, who's another individual we can turn to as recovery practitioners to learn more and think about the ways that we build recovery capital out in the community. So this is my last slide. I did want to touch on just some light reading I was doing the other day about how important it is to build recovery capital. And in thinking, some recent studies came out that demonstrated that in the first 6 months after somebody has initiated their recovery, they actually have a decrease in self-esteem, self-efficacy, in general overall happiness. And so someone like me who went through this process, no one told me that I might expect that. And so we often have things like graduations from treatment. And so people graduate and they think, oh, great, like I did this, I tackled this, I'm done with this. And then we go back home and we don't have the information we need that our journey is really just being initiated. We're just at a starting place, and how important that is. And we might not always tell the people that we work with that we might see that decrease, because it's hard work being in recovery, especially when we're in early recovery. So even having those honest conversations with people that we might feel a little kind of dip in how we're feeling and our overall kind of life satisfaction, but that does return, and that tends to increase for the first 15 years somebody's in recovery. And then we kind of see it stabilize. Another area we can start to really work on is providing education to family members and friends. Again, building up that native support, that support that someone's returning to after they've been medically stabilized, and building up those supports so that whole system kind of knows what the individual is going through or might go through, and it helps that home support to better be able to address any issues that arise in real time. And someone, at least myself, I'm really comforted when the people around me understand what I'm going through. And then we just always want to increase those linkages. We want to be sure that clinical providers are a part of the recovery community. We want to see that active, involved engagement, increase in partnership, so that transition from a clinical setting to the community is more seamless. I see there's another question, Rebecca.
Yeah. One person's asking, can you repeat the resources that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk?
Absolutely. So the Recovery Research Institute, and again, if you just Google Recovery Research Institute, is just has a huge amount of resources on current research being done on the recovery community, recovery support services, peer recovery support services, and because that field is just really exploding right now. And then the other one I mentioned was, I believe it was William White's work. And so he's a recovery historian. All his work and his blogs and his papers are now housed at chestnut.org. And so he used to have his own site, and now Chestnut, where he kind of became William White, where he came up and practiced for a long time, houses all of his blogs and information. And he does a ton of work around recovery-oriented systems of care and recovery management. He has a ton of white papers, research, monographs, just endless resources if that field is interesting to you.
One other question, do you have any information on whether mocktails are helpful or triggering for people in recovery?
I don't know that any studies have been done on that. What I can say is, being somebody who came from the 25 years in the hospitality industry, I appreciate it, but I think it's an individual choice too. You know, and again, it's about maybe not othering, and finding ways. I find it's to me, it's including me in the experience that I want to have when I go out to eat, or I want to go out to celebrate. For me, it's a really nice thing to have a special treat. But I think that's a individual decision.
All right, well, yes, we've got people commenting, you know, it depends on the person, and some find it not helpful and other people do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're just going to see more of that. But again, I think it's about having a conversation, right? And then if you're working in a clinical setting, how is that person that you're sitting across the table from or with, where do they go to get their information when they return home to their natural environment and they start to go out to eat, and there are mocktails, or there's the zero proof beverages where you can, you know, now order zero proof whiskey or zero proof gin or zero proof vodka. It's about connecting them to places where they can have honest conversations around how they're going to manage that for themselves. Because these things exist in our world. Chances are they're going to come across it sooner or later, or be put in a situation where they are making decisions. And how can we build up, again, their recovery capital so that they're making the best decisions for themselves?
All right, well, I don't see any other questions. I'll give you another quick minute to pop something in the Q&A as we near the end of our time together. I want to remind everyone that we will be posting the recording of this session and information from the session on our website, the ATTC website. And so you could share it with colleagues. And Kris, do you have any closing remarks? I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, wait a minute, here comes one. Oh goodness, all right, sure, you asked for it and it happens. Ideas to introduce communities to effective prevention in primary. Heather, I might need some more information there. It's not dare or just say no, primary prevention.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah.
I know, like, for myself, I started attending local prevention coalition meetings as an individual because that was valuable and important to me. And I learned a ton because I thought recovery and prevention might be at odds, because I grew up at a time where just say no and dare were really prevalent. And then when I learned how prevention works, I think prevention and recovery are actually completely aligned. We have the same goals. And I think the fields of prevention and recovery should be doing a lot more partnering because, again, our mission, our goals are completely aligned. And I think, again, we're looking at that population-based, community-based health and wellness. And that's what both of us want, like what both those fields are looking to do. And we both have different ways of doing it. So I think those are potentially really fruitful partnerships.
Yeah, I think that's what Heather was getting at. She added a comment that how do we prevent SUD? Most recovery communities are not aware of effective prevention strategies, but when you work together, in partnership. You learn about each other's modalities and can support each other. One more quick question with a minute. Have any of you provided care for someone who has relapsed with drinking alcohol-based mouthwash? Years ago, a friend who relapsed a couple of years was drinking male colognes and things
Mhm.
like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people get their needs met when they're determined to get their needs met. And so sometimes we see people resorting to drinking hand sanitizer, like you said, colognes, mouthwashes, and those things. And so I frame it like they're trying to get their needs met, which helps me then, if I'm working with them, understand that they're going to extreme measures to get their needs met.
Kris, I want to thank you. We're at the half hour here, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had over 200 folks participating, and it's the end of a series, but hopefully the beginning of something new. I hope that you all have a wonderful day and take some of this information forward and share it with colleagues and community.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kris. Thank you all for being here.